Welcome to the Prepped and Polished podcast, the podcast that empowers you to take control of your education, featuring weekly interviews with influencers in the world of education, as well as tutoring tips, lessons, and updates. And now, here's your host, Alexis Avila.
And welcome back to the Prepped and Polished podcast, a What's Hot K-12 podcast on iTunes. This is episode number 148. I'm Alexis Avila, your host. Be sure to join our community. You can find us on SoundCloud, Facebook, Twitter, Google+, Instagram, and YouTube. Just type Prepped and Polished and you'll find us. Go to preppedandpolished.com for more info and sign up for our free ACT essay course on the front page of our site, preppedandpolished.com. If you need tutoring, you can reach us at 781-753-9951 or shoot me an email, info@preppedandpolished.com. Have a question or reaction during or after the podcast, submit your question or radio at preppedandpolished.com. Today on episode 148, I'm talking to guest Brad Baldridge, a late-stage college planning specialist. Brad helps parents of high school students plan and pay for college using strategies such as merit aid, need-based aid, tax planning, savings, and investing for college, negotiating with colleges, scholarships, and loans. Over the past 10 years, Brad has directly helped hundreds of families plan and pay for college. He's provided in-depth college plans, resulting in increased financial aid, scholarships, identification of the right schools at the right price, and better loans. Brad's expertise is featured weekly on his podcast, Taming the High Cost of College. Since 2013, Brad and his expert guests have explored and shared great information related to college planning. Brad received his Bachelor's of Science degree from University of Wisconsin-Platteville in 1990. On today's episode, Brad gives parents advice on how to better manage their child's college education. So let's get right to our guests. This is episode number 148 with Brad Baldridge of Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Brad, thanks for coming on the Prepped and Polished podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great.
Can you share with us some steps that you took to become a nationally known financial advisor?
Yes, I worked very hard in the college planning arena and kind of built a specialty. And I used that specialty, again, as a way to help parents and families in ways that most other financial planners aren't able to because they, quite honestly don't have the expertise in this particular area.
And what types of services does Baldridge collegesolutions.com provide?
We help families plan and prepare for college. And what we focus on is what I would call late stage college planning. In other words, you have a parent or your parents of a junior, sophomore, maybe senior in high school. So that's a little bit different than early stage. When you have a 2-year-old and you want to save and invest for college, you certainly can and perhaps should do that. But whether you saved or not, once you get to a 16, 17-year-old, college is here. And now you need to figure it out. How are you going to pay for it? Now, if you've done a good job saving, great. Now you figure out how to spend your pile of money efficiently. Unfortunately, many families don't have a pile of money and or their pile isn't big enough. And now they're trying to figure out, well, how do we fill the gaps? Is it need-based aid, merit aid, tax planning, additional savings and investment, loans, all the different avenues that parents need to work on. And then another big piece of it is school selection. If you pick an expensive school, you might potentially going to have an expensive price. Whereas if you understand how the system works, there may be schools that will come in at different price points, again, depending on your student and major and lots of factors, including need-based aid and merit-based aid on top of it all.
Oh, that's amazing. And do you have a few counselors on your team, or do you do all the soup to nuts counseling?
Right. So I do it all. And again, I primarily work with families on the financial planning side of things. In other words, how are we going to pay? And a lot of stuff I work on applies to parents. I don't meet students. I'm not the guy that, does things like read essays or help you figure out what you want to be when you grow up. That's, somebody else, they're completely different training set. That's not, kind of what I'm doing. So I work, like I said, one-on-one with families. And I also am starting to offer group activities. Like I've got a podcast out there where you can, just learn as you drive or as you exercise and that kind of stuff. And I'm working on building some courses and other things where it won't necessarily be one-on-one anymore.
That's awesome. And what do families typically do wrong when it comes to financing for college?
I guess the biggest one, and it's a little bit cliche, but I think it applies here, is they start too late, even for late stage planning. So when I talk about late stage planning, it would be ideal if you did your late stage planning with a sophomore or junior instead of waiting till your senior year, because there's a lot to learn. And I think that's where most families fall down, is they don't start early enough, so they kind of run out of time. As an example, I have a lot of parents that talk about scholarships, but by the time they actually get through the process and they look back, they say, well, we never really did work hard on scholarships. We ran out of time because they didn't understand, how scholarships work to begin with. And by the time they figured it out, it was too late. And what essentially happens is it gets to be very busy near the junior, senior year of college with, the normal high school things that you're doing, plus you're, upperclassmen in high school now, and you're taking AP courses, and the students are really busy with that. And they've got their prom and all their normal high school activities, plus college visits and figuring out the ACT or SAT and whether or not they're going to test and prep and how they're going to work through all that. Scholarships in the mix, again, school visits and how do you choose a school and how do you choose a major. The whole application process gets to be very busy with essays and all those pieces of the puzzle as well. And quite frankly, you just run out of time. But it's important that parents realize that there's things that they can do on the financial side that they can start earlier, and they don't necessarily have to include the student on an ongoing basis. They can just say, well, college is in our future. We only have a sophomore right now, so we don't exactly know which college. We don't know what major. We don't know a lot of the details, but we know at least some form of college is part of the plan. And just with that amount of knowledge, you can start thinking about, well, am I going to qualify for need-based aid? Are we going to pursue merit aid? What are we going to do about scholarships? How are we going to do with the testing? What type of student do we have? Is this a student that's going to go somewhere pretty local? And you look around and say, well, there's, 4 private colleges and 6 state schools within 100 miles of here, and we'll probably go to one of those. Or do you have a student that's saying, I'm thinking about going to California or maybe Texas or the East Coast, and I'm looking at these types of schools and those types of schools. It's a much different process when you have to put a couple of road trips in there. And when you're looking at schools that might cost $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year now. And that is one, a big piece of the puzzle. And then the other side of it is, well, what is the family budget? I run into a lot of families that are in, middle income, upper middle income. And the reality is they can afford to pay for college, but they also have other goals. So what I am often telling people is, well, you can afford to pay for college. You can afford to take nice vacations. You can afford to have a second home. You can afford to retire early. What you can't afford is to do all of those things. You're going to have to pick and choose which items are the most important and plan and budget accordingly. And for a lot of families, they, haven't really thought about, well, what's the important pieces here? And they, if you ask a typical parent, they're going to say, oh, absolutely, college is important. But then when you look at, where their money is going, it doesn't necessarily line up. And, the reality for a lot of families is college is going to cost you $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a year or more. And that needs to be factored in. And I think a lot of families don't do as good a job as they could. I use this analogy where I say, college planning for the typical family is like finding your student a job. While doing that, you're also planning a big family vacation, and you're going to go buy a new car. So the kind of effort into all those things, that analogy. So as an example, when people buy a car, most of the time, you don't just say, hey, I'm going to buy a car today, and you wander down to the car dealer, and 2 hours later you drive home in a new car. Most families, spend more time at it. They do some research. They try and figure out what makes and models are appropriate. Do they need a pickup truck, a van, a 4-door, a 2-door, what are they looking for? And then from there, they look at the different companies and compare them and figure out the benefits and features and all that kind of stuff. And then ultimately, then when it comes circles around to price, they hopefully aren't going to pay sticker price, right? They're going to try and negotiate a better deal. All that can be applied to planning and paying for college. Are you going to look around? How much shopping around are you going to do? Are you going to learn the systems and how they work and compare colleges? And then ultimately, do you want to pay sticker price or do you want to pay something less than sticker price? And if you want to pay less, and most people would, how do you do that? Is it going to be, again, negotiations with the school? Is it going to be picking the right schools at the right price? How are you going to make that happen? And then when you throw in, finding a job for the student, that piece of it is kind of the analogy of parents can't necessarily force a student to go get a job and interview well, right? If a student wants a job and they're willing to work hard at it, parents can help. But you can't be the driver of the student going out and getting a job because they've got to present well at the interview. They have to want it to. If they're just going to sit in an interview and say, my mom made me come, well, the odds of them getting the job are pretty small. And it's the same thing with colleges, right? The student needs to be involved. They have to want it too. They may have to put some effort into it, whether it's testing and test planning, visiting, talking with colleges, comparing colleges, figuring out what they want as far as near or far, big or small, what majors, all that kind of stuff. So there's that family dynamic of it has to kind of be a parent-student partnership. And a lot of times it comes at a time when the parents and students aren't necessarily seeing eye to eye, which is, very normal. A typical 17-year-old is trying to mature and is starting to pull away from parents and trying to become their own person at a time when, college is happening at the same time. And there can be a little friction there. So that's, kind of the process that we're dealing with.
If you receive a high income, is college planning still necessary? And what are some tips for higher, middle to higher income earners? Right.
And I guess in my opinion, planning is necessary no matter what level you are. It just changes what type of planning you might do. There's families out there who will not qualify for any sort of need-based aid. In other words, their income or their assets are relatively high, and therefore they're not going to qualify. And I'll caution there's a lot of families out there that have it wrong. They think they're not going to qualify when they will, or the opposite is true. They won't qualify even though they thought they would, because it's the system is relatively complicated and it takes some time and effort to figure it out. But like I said, in the end, a lot of the families I work with do not qualify for need-based aid, but need-based aid is only one small piece of the college planning puzzle. And if you're not going to get need-based aid, what are you going to do? Again, as you look at higher income, higher asset families, now it's more important that maybe you do tax planning, or you save and invest properly, or you spend the right assets at the right time. Should I take money out of this account or that account? Or should I have my college investments in stocks or bonds or in the bank? Or what kind of tax benefits can I get? Should I be using 529s or should I be using UTMA accounts? And there's all kinds of planning around, how you do your assets, and then leveraging things like loans. Some parents look at student loans and say, wow, student loan, rates are kind of expensive. I can borrow money cheaper than that on my home equity. Well, great. Perhaps you can. And that would be part of the planning of, should I use those types of loans instead of student loans? There's pluses and minuses. Then there's, if you're a business owner, there's strategies you can use around owning a business to help pay for college. Things like hiring your student in the business. I've had a couple families where the students are working in the family restaurant and dad would just pay them cash under the table. They'd work a Saturday afternoon shift and he'd give them, $50 for their dates and their cell phone and whatever. And instead of putting them officially on the payroll and paying them. Well, that was costing them quite a lot in taxes, as well as potentially interfering with financial aid because of where the income shows up and understanding, how that whole system works. So there's lots you can do. And for every, I always tell people there's probably 100 or more college planning strategies. The challenge is to figure out the 3, 5, 10 that will apply to your situation, because every family is a little bit different.
Now, if you receive a low-income earner, if a low-income, obviously there's a lot of ways to finance college. What are just like maybe one or two that come to your mind, like big ones we should know?
Well, of course, then as your income is lower, you qualify for need-based. And not only if your income is low, but a lot of times we see situations, divorces and separations where there's a temporary problem in income or assets or something where you can take advantage of it. Or a business owner who's down on their luck and, maybe the business isn't doing real well for a year or two. But if you're in those situations, you would potentially qualify for more need-based aid. And then you might qualify again for grants and scholarships that other families would not qualify for because of your financial situation. Now, typically what I see at all income levels is the amount of aid you get based on the need-based aid formulas is never quite enough to really make college easy. The typical family earning $50,000 and they have a net cost of $5,000 or $10,000 for college feels like that's painful and they're not getting enough aid. A family earning $150,000, maybe their net cost for college is $20,000 or $25,000. They're in that same boat. They're saying this doesn't feel comfortable. This is not enough. We're not getting as much aid as we feel. And that's, kind of across the board where most families beyond just need-based aid are going to have to work on things like merit aid and scholarships and saving and investing. And maybe the student's going to have to work while they're in school or during the summers. Maybe you're going to look at some loans. A typical family uses all different avenues and kind of piles, all these different pieces together to come up with how they're going to pay for college. And again, everybody looks a little different when it's done.
Do you recommend going perhaps as an option to save an arm and a leg in college, the community college route as an option toward earning your 4-year degree?
Yeah. As a numbers and cents type of thing, it makes perfect sense that you essentially get your education at the lowest price points you can. So if it's basic courses that you can take at a community college or a 2-year college, and every state has some satellite, colleges and so forth that might be lower cost and live at home, that's great. The challenge I see is for a lot of parents and students, they want the college experience, and that college experience is worth spending some money for. And obviously not everybody. So yes, it's a great avenue to lower your costs, but it might conflict a little bit with what it is you're trying to do. And that's where you have to look at value instead of just cost. Because if we only looked at cost, everybody would be buying and driving the cheapest car out there. Yet we don't, right? People buy minivans and big pickup trucks and expensive sports cars because they feel they have a need for it or a want for it, whatever it might be. So that's kind of balancing your needs and wants in that regard. But as college is getting more expensive, that avenue, a lot of colleges now are out there preparing that avenue. And they're saying, you know what, as a 4-year institution, we're going to partner with a 2-year institution. And we're going to say you can take a year or two at this institution and then transfer to us. And we'll verify that the credits will transfer and it'll be a nice, smooth process. So if you can find those programs and they're right for you, great. Where we see a bigger challenge is if it's kind of an impromptu thing. I went a year or two here and now I want to transfer there, and you lose credits because it wasn't seamless. It wasn't planned ahead. So if you are going to go the route of starting somewhere and transferring elsewhere, spend the time to figure out if you're taking the right courses and make sure that they're going to transfer. Because a lot of times, you'll take a couple of courses, then when you go to transfer, they're going to say, oh, yes, you needed to have a math class, but not that math class. That's the wrong one. That one can't be used. It's not going to apply. You have to take math over again. And obviously that's not the goal. And you need to be careful in that process.
Tell us a little bit about your podcast, Taming the High Cost of College. How many episodes have you done? What type of guests do you have on the show, or do you have guests, and how can we listen to it?
Right. Well, great. Taming the High Cost of College, that's an interview. I guess the last 50 or 60, I've been in interviews, and I interview experts in all areas, from financial planners to authors and website creators and all the people in the various education fields, because essentially you're going to have a lot to learn, whether it's, again, test prep or financial planning or saving, investing, or loans. And I talk to all kinds of experts in all those areas and kind of get their take. And we tend to talk a little bit more on the financial side of things. In other words, how does test prep, although it costs money, how does it help you save money and in the long run? And is it worth it? And that type of thing. So, and it's a show. It's available at tamingthehighcostofcollege.com. Each episode's, 30, 40 minutes long. And again, a lot of great information. I always, I'm a podcaster, and I also listen to podcasts. And where I recommend parents is, if you've got a freshman or sophomore, that might be a great way to just start learning the language and understanding what's going on out there, because there's lots and lots of things that you could learn about if you spent the time, getting aware of what's going on. Things like gap years and study abroad and all the various books out there about how to do college successfully. And I mean, there's just a wealth of information out there, but most families don't spend the time to learn about the information and then consume that information.
Definitely. And teenage years, pretty exciting, overwhelming time in one's life. To any teens listening to us today, any words of wisdom before they cross that bridge?
Do it on purpose instead of by accident. I think that was the biggest challenge recently. We had a lot of graduates when we were in the Depression, where kids were graduating and they weren't able to find work, and they got a little jaded because in the past, kind of when you and I graduated, it was kind of the normal track. You go to high school, then you go to college, then you get a job, and it all just falls into place. You don't have to work at it. Well, I don't think that's as true anymore. So if you're going to go to college, do it on purpose. Figure out why you're going, what you're going to do while you're there, how to get the most for whatever it is that you're doing. If you're paying for a 4-year education, whether it's your parents helping you or you're paying directly, take advantage of what's there. There's tutoring offices, and there's career placement offices, and there's clubs and organizations that you can join that'll start you into your career long before you get there. You can become a student member of whatever major or career path you're looking at. Like if you're getting into accounting, the accounting organizations allow students to join and go to their conferences and even present at their conferences and do research and all that kind of stuff. So do it on purpose instead of just saying, well, I'm just going to show up and do what's required and get good grades. Because that, although that works for some, doesn't work for everybody, and you need to spend some time. And there's some great books out there on how to. One that comes to mind for me is How to College. It's a relatively quick read, and Kat Klaus wrote one, and I'm trying to remember what hers is. But there's a number of great books out there that are geared towards the student and learning about taking advantage of whatever you can to. Again, do it on purpose and make the most of it.
That's awesome. Well, Brad, thanks so much for coming on the Prepped and Polished podcast, and appreciate your wisdom and your time.
All right. Thanks for having me.
And this wraps up our show today. This was episode 148 with Brad Baldridge. To connect with Brad and listen to his amazing podcast, go to tamingthehighcostofcollege.com. I hope you enjoyed episode number 148 with Brad Baldridge. Make sure to go back and listen to episode number 31. It was my interview with Celeste Horton about creative ways to pay for college. Tune in soon to hear our next podcast, episode number 149, which will be our next tutoring tips episode. And to access today's episode number 148 with Brad and all of our podcast episodes, head over to preppedandpolished.com/podcast or go to soundcloud.com/preppedandpolished. Thank you for joining us today on the Prepped and Polished podcast. Now go out there and take control of your education.
You've been listening to the Prepped and Polished podcast. For more information, check out preppedandpolished.com. Also, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for listening. Class dismissed.